Welcome to Grief in the Room. In this podcast, we do a deep dive into all things grief, so that when those themes of grief and loss show up in your client's story, you're prepared with the insight, tools, and most importantly, confidence to give them the kind of support they need. Grief in the Room is presented by Martin Ruddis and Trudy Bamford, grief trainers and advocates, and good friends. We bring warmth, humanity and humour to this subject, and we're so glad you're joining our conversation today. Please do subscribe to and say hello to us in the comments. Right, so can we start the story from the start? So you were reading The Grieving Brain, and you realised that the inference that was placed upon the dual process model when you were handed it during your bereavement support training wasn't the same way that Mary Frances delivered it, which in the book, which made you dig deeper and look deeper, and you took it back to the original model, and you discovered. What did you discover?
That both the loss-oriented work and the restoration-oriented work are both stresses. It is not that the restoration is the relief from the stressful work of grieving. It is a different type of work.
Yes. So the inference that when I delivered it to you when we were in the classroom back in the day was that, and even the graphics, I can recall the graphics in my mind because I see them still quite often. Sunshine, moving to the light. You know, and the way I coined it when I reached out to Henk and Maggie was almost that everybody has, like, it's a Disneyfication of their original model. But you brought this to me because of our continued relationship outside of the classroom and as volunteers and now as collaborators. You brought it to me and said, it's just not sitting right because the inference is wrong. And then you made a movie. You made a new animation, and you did a voiceover, and that's what you released on LinkedIn a while ago.
Yeah.
Emphasizing that the loss orientated and the restoration orientated are both stressors. Okay. With that movie, I then sent it to Maggie and Henk, or Stroebe and Schut, and said, hello, how do you feel about this? Which started us collaborating with them, and lots of emails and lots of fantastic, amazing discussions. And we got great insights into their character and how they collaborated and how they worked. And they came back to us. And do you remember clearly what they said in that first email?
No. I do remember them commenting that they felt that perhaps the use of the word restoration originally may have somewhat contributed to the way that it has gradually become misunderstood, which makes perfect sense.
Perfect sense.
Because we do think of restorative things as being lovely and gentle and a relief.
A restoration. So the other thing that Maggie mentioned to us as well was our inference that we still placed on it as time as well, past and future. Because in your little movie that we released to the general public, and I think it's still on our website, elephantsinrooms.co.uk, we mention the loss phase being past orientated, perhaps, and the restoration phase being future.
So when I was creating the video, that was my addition to it. I chose to add that the loss-oriented work was more looking to the past and what's been lost. Whereas the restoration-oriented work is more about the rebuilding, therefore it's looking to the future. But they made the extremely valid point that they are both actually present day experiences.
And at that stage then, they also said, but what you've said is intriguing and interesting to us because we had not considered it and framed it like that. So, in actual fact, they loved the simplicity, they loved the visuals and the explanation, but then, as what happens with these conversations with the grief greats, the giants that we stride on the backs of all the time, more came in, and what Maggie then and Henk brought in was something that they've not done in their model to date yet. In fact, we need to have a chat with them about this podcast before we let it out, because this is our creative process almost to a degree, isn't it? They brought to us the overload, and they brought to us about rumination as well. And then they explored the time elements with us as well. So because of summer holidays, because of busyness and work, because of college, because of all sorts of stuff, we have not put together that final clip to send back to them. I know we sent another version back, but that was just a walkthrough. But we haven't put together the polished product, have we?
No. But what's been lovely is, I think we spoke in a previous episode about us being responsible rebels, meaning that we won't just accept something without questioning it and looking for the inference and seeing, does this work? And that is very much the feeling I got in all of our interactions with them too.
Yeah.
This is one of the absolute foundation stones of grief theory, and yet they were so beautifully open to discussing it and exploring it and looking at it through different eyes, and what's your perspective on this? And so we're still in that process, aren't we, of kind of bouncing that back and forth between us, which is a humbling thing. I love that is their approach. I love that their approach is to
collaborate,
still be open. Still be open.
I mean, you're right. I mean, when they presented this, I think it was 93. Was it 93 they created it, and then 99 that it was launched to the mass. The novelty of this was the oscillation, and it was just incredible in terms of because they decided basically back in the day that between Bowlby, who had the phase model, shock, yearning, protest, despair, restitution, and then the task model from Bill Warden, again, I mean, Bowlby was a student of Freud. I mean, these are just building upon the work of and reinterpreting, and that takes bravery. The pioneers. And then the task model, which was accept reality of loss, experience the pain of grief, adjust to life without deceased, and relocate deceased emotionally and move on. That was the actual task model, which we all recognize the words, where they come from, and also how things have changed now. But what they brought in, their key pivot for their model was the oscillation, the pendulum swing between these two spheres. And it's interesting when you say we're both responsible rebels. We actually, because of that word restoration, and because I think Maggie gave us that little, perhaps that wasn't the best word, we came up with new words, didn't we? I can't actually remember what those new words were now. Rebuilding. But I think so far on the creative process, rebuilding has now stopped.
Yeah. That one's still a work in progress.
So we haven't really spoken about this, as you said right at the very start, probably in a bit of the clip that we're not going to use. You said to me, you're still using your video or the slides that you built that video from, because we haven't come to an agreement. We haven't signed anything off, have we, between ourselves?
We haven't finalized it. No, we haven't finalized it because, we've tried to incorporate the overload that we've talked about with them, but we haven't actually finalized how it's going to be. And
so, Trudy, can I just take this opportunity then? Because since then, it's been a few months, and I've delivered lots of grief awareness, lots of grief by suicide, lots of grief first aid training on behalf of crews and other stuff. And I've actually been using our work in progress slide deck to do the dual process model. So I've become quite used to it now in the way I'm describing it. And I know it's not been officially signed so apologies. But if I go through that with you now, which makes me a little bit vulnerable, because on this camera you can say why. Should we do that?
Absolutely. Before you even start, I'm going to say on the other one, you kept saying loss orientated, restoration orientated.
But I think you hit me on that a while ago, didn't you?
Yeah. It's just one of my bugbears, but you haven't put it on this one, so
Just
can't
one of
catch
your
you out.
bugbears.
Yeah, I got herds of them.
You are elephantine.
It's like people saying ATM machines. Don't even get me started.
But that's what they were back in the day.
No, the M is machine.
ATM. Oh, ATM machines.
Yes.
Yeah, it's also when writing my stuff for college, I went into the habit of putting REBT therapy. The T is the therapy.
One of my other ones is people saying the proof is in the pudding. It's not. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. These things keep me awake at night. I'm handing you this on a plate, Martin. I know you're going to use this.
I want to keep this in. Yeah.
I know you can keep it in.
No, we've made a promise. I will never publish anything that you don't agree with.
I just gave you permission.
Oh dear.
I like words to be right. This is, people will learn this about me.
But in truth, you're keeping me honest, more honest than I have been before, because we do sometimes disagree on words, don't we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But we always find an agreement, which is lovely.
It is. Right. So if you are a grief counsellor or trainee, or you're in the grief field, you're going to be familiar with the dual process model from Stroebe and Schut. But what we would say is that the version that you're familiar with, even on the Great Grief charities and the Great Grief sites, and if you follow people on LinkedIn, they're not posting it with the same inference that we're about to present to you. So what I would say, and I'm truly, this is not scripted, I'm going to be shooting from the hip.
And I just want to interject there. Sorry, was I interrupting your sentence?
No, okay. Interject.
I just want to interject there. It really matters.
Why?
It really matters.
Why?
When we are using somebody else's work to understand what they were trying to say with it.
Yeah.
And it matters for that reason. But it also matters specifically in the context of this. As we're going to go through, it will become apparent why it matters. So just because something has become understood a certain way, it's not enough to accept that if that is not what the original researchers, psychologists, academics wanted it to say. They worked incredibly hard on this. They would have been developing this for such a long time. So it really, really matters if we are learning grief theory, if we are teaching grief theory, if we are supporting the bereaved. It matters to get this right.
So how does that sit with, say, for example, Lois Tonkin and Growing Around Grief, which we'll do probably very soon as well? Because people use that in so many different ways and put so many different inferences on it and depict it in so many ways. I suppose it doesn't matter.
I think because that is a very much more simplistic piece of grief understanding. This is quite an academically solidly based piece of grief theory, as it should be, because it is one of the cornerstones.
Yeah.
And it was groundbreaking in its time.
So much has been built on it.
Yeah. But I think because it came from academics, sometimes people find that a little bit hard to get their heads around. So they try to simplify it and they try to soften the edges of it. but it's unnecessary, as we're going to go through, because the changes that have been made to it to make it seem more appealing, if you like,
Yeah.
they're actually built into the model anyway.
And in actual fact, when you brought this to me and we started to have chats about this before you made your movie, because I always used to say to the trainees, the cruise volunteer trainees, look, you can hand this over to your bereaved clients if that's the way that your conversations are going and you feel that your client will be receptive to hearing it. But also, what I really want you to do is to be able to know it, understand it, and have it yourself. So in the back of your mind, it's a framework. So when you're speaking to someone that's grieving, you can detect in your own mind, are they oscillating, and be able to relate to that. And I was worried that when you brought it to me, your the correct inference, it wouldn't be something that's now as good to hand over to the bereaved. But I think now it's even better. I yeah.
I think that's a really valid point, though. Some of the grief theory that is taught that we need to understand, we may think twice about sharing. Some of them, like Tonkins, is much more, easy for somebody bereaved to understand. But that doesn't preclude this being used, because this model, for me, this is the one that I use with people. This is the only one, apart from the grieving brain, that I use with bereaved clients, because it does two important things.
Yeah.
What?
Are you telling me that you don't use the waterfall of grief?
No, I do not. This model does two really important things. It gives people permission to grieve.
Yeah.
And it gives them hope of rebuilding, but permission to find that difficult too.
Yeah.
So,
And I have to say, since I've been using this version as well, and I'll open it up to discussion afterwards after I've presented it, it's been incredibly relatable. And these are people that aren't looking to be full-time grief counsellors or they're grief first aiders. So it's a pop-up role to support someone in their grief, along with their day jobs and their busy accountabilities. And they've said that is just so useful to know. Really has been.
And after all, let's not forget, this was in direct contrast at the time to the linear stages of grief model, which has lodged itself in the collective consciousness. So when we present this, or we present the principles of this to somebody bereaved or somebody who is supporting somebody bereaved, this is one of the main points of this model, is that it is not point A to point B. So yeah, for that very reason alone, it's a useful one to share.
Okay, so this is how we are, or how I am framing this. So this is the dual process model from Stroebe and Schut. As in my mind now, I cannot get away from Maggie and Henk, because that's how they sign off their emails to us, and that's how me and Trudy, when we're doing this process, think about them. So back in '99, they had there was lots of models now starting to evolve. We've certainly moved on from the Freudian days and Freudian thoughts, but we had all the metaphorical children of Freud, and the models were being built. When Stroebe and Schut got together and started to look at this grief process, their biggest thing that they gave us was oscillation. So what they identified was there were two spheres: the loss-orientated work and the restoration-orientated work. And their biggest insight was that there was a pendulum swing, an oscillation between these two spheres, wrapped around as we're going through our everyday life experiences. Now, whilst they are not time-orientated, certainly when we are recently bereaved, we are facing acute grief, we become loss-orientated. So we can become more inwards focused, but I'll unpack that. So we become loss orientated. So what does that mean? So when we become loss orientated, we're into those morning rituals. So if we've got a culture or a custom or a faith, there's quite some good structure, or quite some structure, not necessarily good, wrapped around that. Day 1 this, day 2 that, a week that, 30 days that, 12 days of mourning that. So it all has different effects. And that can be quite comforting, but we'll talk about that in general grief. So the sadmin. So there is a natural withdrawal for others. And I used to describe this as, literally we can withdraw into a room of grief, where we amplify that volume, we shut the door, and we become insular. So our loss is focused inwards. We're shutting out the world around us. We are not focused on that. We can get absorbed in reliving, remembering, yearning for what has gone. Also ruminating, okay? And all this work pushes away the idea of rebuilding and reintegrating or growing around our grief, because we've got to figure it all out. We are now me or I as opposed to we. So the brain is literally in this phase of they're gone, the conscious knowledge they're gone, but they're everlasting, the implicit knowledge. So there's that dissonance. So we are literally focused on our grief. We are grief orientated doing this loss work. Okay. And again, this is a point we'll build on later. This grief can intrude. So we have lots of invasive thoughts. Now, we have invasive thoughts all the time, but when we're in this acute grieving process, we can have lots more coming into us, and they can have a negative effect, or they can have a negative inference, or they can be quite stressful, because literally that mechanical rewiring process hasn't even thought about starting yet, hasn't even thought about it. Trudy, is there anything you'd like to add before I move on through the slides?
That although this isn't time limited, it makes sense to us that in the acute early stages of grief, it is likely you will spend all, if or most of your time in loss oriented work.
Work's an interesting word, and I think it was Maggie and Henk that actually coined that work concept as well, grief as work. Pretty sure they did, but they certainly use it, and I know Mary Frances refers to it in her work and her book as well. So let's talk about the restoration orientated work. Now, this is where we start to engage with the work around us again. Literally, we are picking up the reins of our life, taking on new challenges and responsibilities, and that rebuilding can involve new relationships. And I'm not talking about a romantic relationship, just new relationships now as a me as an individual, as opposed to as a we. We often hear people say, am I a parent if my child has died? Am I still a son or a daughter if I've got no parents? I mean, all these thoughts and cognitions are swirling around. What am I? Who am I? If we're not talking about death, but we are certainly with this at the moment, even though you can apply this model to lots of different aspects, not just about bereavement and grief over the loss of a loved one, it may be status. So it may be I'm not now that athlete, I've had an injury. It may be I'm not now that Olympian, I'm not now that counsellor, I'm not now that sergeant major, or whoever or whatever. So, it could be other losses will still apply to this model. So, yeah, we've got change in relationships. And although rebuilding may seem positive in nature from an outside view, it can be stressful. And that's the big thing. Doing this work is stressful. So, for example, in some of our training courses, we talk about Bob. Now, Bob had a relationship with his wife who died suddenly, and she had the responsibility for all the children because he was away as a traveling salesman. Okay. But when she died, he now has child responsibility. So he is that phone call from school. He is that picking up when ill, staying at home. So he can't just go off. That was their division of labor. That's what we do when we're in a loving relationship, forming those bonds. We outsource so much to our partners. And that's changed. I give the example quite often that if I was to die tomorrow, my wife, Fiona, who is a very functional globe-trotting psychologist, would get on with life. Of course she would. But she would soon realize that my instructions on how to clean the dishwasher filter really should have been paid attention to, because she won't even remember that there's a filter there. It will be a real struggle for her, and it will cause her a lot of angst and challenges. Feeding the cats at 6 o'clock in the morning, because that's not her job at all. But she'd have to adapt to that. electrics in the house, DIY, the washing machine's in the garage. That's my tasks, my responsibilities. So if there was electrical problems, these things are all restoration orientated work. As she adapts and grows around her grief, there will be a challenge to her. There will be a struggle. They would cause real challenges. So that's the restoration orientated work, and it is work.
And those are all examples that, yes, we can see quite clearly that that is going to be stressful. But restoration oriented work, rebuilding work, they can also be positive changes. Okay. For example, having a change in goals or purpose. Regularly I follow some incredible people on LinkedIn, like Alice Hendy, Caroline Woodhope, I think her name is. They have dedicated their lives, because of the grief they suffered, to helping other people. Now, that change from the outside could look like it's nothing but positive. Somebody takes on a new goal, has a whole new meaning and purpose in life. You could look at that from the outside and think, oh, they must be doing really, really well if they're able to do that. But it will all come with a price. If you've lost your brother to suicide and you've dedicated the rest of your life to trying to prevent suicide, yes, you're achieving incredible things. This is part of restoration-oriented work, but it's going to be costing you. It's going to be creating stress and pain, even if it doesn't look like that from the outside. So all of this restoration-oriented work, whether it's things that we might easily identify as stressful, like an elderly lady having to learn how to do the banking, we get that would be stressful, or very positive seeming changes, like you go back to work or you take on a new project and people think, oh, they must be getting over it because they're able to move on a bit now. It is all, whether it's positive work or negative seeming work, it will all be costing, it will all be creating stress.
So we have these two spheres that Stroebe and Schut suggested that we oscillate between the loss-orientated work and the restoration-orientated work. And we have that pendulum swing between them as we're going through life and life is growing around us. But what can happen, because the nature of them are both stressors, we can reach a phase where it's just all too much, overload, and we can just lose, our ability to function. We can just crumple because it's just stressful, too stressful. Why? Well, because at certain stages, as we carry on, because time doesn't stop, if we think about that waterfall and that river of life goes and keeps on going, as we carry on, everyday life experiences are still happening. We will still experience the loss and the restoration stresses, but at certain times, the loss stresses may be more in the house, more present. So we may be bereaved again. Something may have happened that amplifies our loss, our grief. We may be cut off. COVID was a great example of that. It may be that it is an anniversary, any anniversary, a death day, a wedding day, a birthday. So these anniversaries that will come along and amplify our grief. So we can choose to literally enter into that room of grieving again, become inwardly focused and go through that amplified grief process. Or it may be sometimes that it's not invited in. So it may be that scent in the air, that picture, that holiday, that food, that joke with friends or seeing particular friends. We may get drawn back in, okay? So that's where the loss can be amplified. Or it may be the restoration. It may be, in my house, for example, the electrics stop working, and all of a sudden Fiona has to deal with all my DIY budgets I've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years since we've been in the house. So that could cause her huge challenges. Or maybe, not ours, but with the cats, or maybe dealing with the kids, or dealing with, necessary restoration events that may amplify the restoration stressors. Over time, as everyday life experiences and we carry to navigate and grow along with our grief, we are still going to oscillate between loss and restoration stresses because grief doesn't go away. How we react to our grief on our grieving journey, when that grief visits us in those moments, that does change, and that we talk about more later. But it's still there, and we're still going to be oscillating. I know, Trudy, that we haven't spoken about being stuck in either sphere as well. And I also haven't talked about rumination, grief rumination, because I think that's going to be a part 2 to this as well. Because Maggie took us down a line of the impact of rumination and the 2 rumination theories. Fascinating stuff. We know that ruminating can amplify that loss-orientated stressors. Again, another conversation. So, Trudy, would you like to add something in or say something?
This is where the way that the restoration-oriented work has become misunderstood, this is where it clearly becomes unnecessary, because they baked into the model the fact that there would be time when you would not be in either sphere, that you would just be experiencing everyday life. And that is the kind of thing that maybe is currently being thought of as restoration. So, going to a spa for a day or having a lovely lunch with friends and laughing and just forgetting for a while. That is not restoration work. That is part of everyday life experience. And as time goes on and you spend less time in the loss work and the restoration work, you spend more time in those everyday experiences. And if you don't, that is where the overload comes in that you were referring to earlier. So if you're either in the loss work or the restoration work all the time, and time goes on, and you're not spending more time in just everyday life, that's where that overload will hit.
And I think that when they brought the overload to us, it just and when we started to emphasize that the restoration and the loss and the overload, it all made so much perfect sense to me, I have to say. And it makes perfect sense as I'm explaining it as well. And the words will only get better because that's what happens with practice and with a deeper understanding. But when I present it like that and give some examples, I find people in the room also start to relate to it more and start to talk about it. It's certainly not some form of academic study about grief that's not relatable. It is so relatable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it gives people permission. That's the point of it.
Validation.
It gives people permission to whatever state they are currently in. It's normal. It's normal to have days where you can't get out of bed.
Mm-hmm.
It's normal to maybe struggle a little bit taking on new responsibilities, and for that to cause pangs. And it's normal to forget. It's normal to forget and find yourself laughing at something and then feeling guilty because you forgot for a moment. It is all normal. It is all valid. It's all acceptable. So I think, the understanding the inference as they originally intended it still gives people permission and it still gives people hope. For me, one of the key takeaways from this model that I want people to understand and remember, whether they are the grieving or whether they are supporting the grieving, is grieving is an active process of adaptation. And as part of that adaptation, it involves tasks that are stressful, that are exhausting, that will take from you, even if to the outside view, those might seem very positive, very forward-looking tasks. Adaptation is hard, but thankfully we are capable of adaptation. That's one of the incredible things about humans. We have that resilience. We are learning creatures, and we have the capability, no matter how tragic the loss, we have the capability of adaptation. But that is very rarely a straightforward process. Adaptation is usually 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. That is normal. And I think that for me is one of the lovely things about this model, is that it is just really, really validating that, but also leaving people with hope that as time goes on, yes, because the grief is always going to be part of you, you are going to spend time in the loss work and the restoration work for the rest of your life.
Mm.
But you will have a little bit more control over that. And perhaps the turmoil maybe that once evoked may diminish with time, and life will grow around it so that you are spending less time dealing with that and more time just living. We know that you don't move on from grief. We know that this is not a time constrained disorder to recover from.
Yes.
But we also recognize that sometimes people can get stuck.
Yes.
We do know that. So, just reflecting on the lessons from this model, if you are working perhaps with a client and it feels to you like they are really, really stuck and they are in a huge amount of distress because of that, come back to this model. Look at that person within the context of the lessons and the principles in the dual process model. Are they not allowing themselves time in the loss work? Or they are not allowing themselves time in the restoration work, maybe because it feels disloyal? Or are they not allowing themselves time off so that they are in that overload state? Just kind of reframing, because as therapists, when a client is stuck, we can absorb that stuckness and feel really stuck ourselves and feel frustrated. So if that is your experience, if you're working with someone and it does feel like, because let's be realistic here, in grief support you are going to keep going round and round in circles with people. That's normal. That's to be expected. But if it maybe feels like it is worse than that, it's bigger than that, and you can tell that this is literally all their life, that they really are deeply, deeply enmeshed in this, go back to this model.
Yeah,
See what you can draw from it, and what you can use with them, and to help you to deepen your empathy with them as well.
Very good. So, yeah, and keep an eye out for the great work what we've not touched on here as well is all the work that they've done about rumination, and they were the scientific brains behind lots of studies into rumination with eye movement measurements and joysticks and moving pictures that Mary Frances kind of alludes to, but references in the book, but doesn't talk more about. It's more in the papers that we've read since from Maggie and Henk. So we're going to have to cover that in another pod. Thank you for joining our conversation today. This episode of Grief in the Room was presented by Martin Roddis and Trudy Bamford. Join us next time when we'll be talking about
bereavement by drugs and alcohol.
This is something that you have been passionate about for a long time.
I have been kind of quietly campaigning behind the scenes for there to be more training on this topic, because there is very little training available, certainly in the UK, for how to work with people bereaved by drugs and alcohol. And yet, those deaths are at an all-time high. So as therapists, as counsellors, as supporters, as volunteers, we are going to be encountering people with this kind of bereavement more and more regularly. And these bereavements do need special handling. So even if you don't currently have clients who are bereaved in this way. Even if you think to yourself, well, I'm not sure that's something I want to work with, I really, really would encourage everybody, all counsellors, all therapists, all volunteers, all supporters of any description, to understand this topic, because you're going to encounter it.